Hello. In this video, we'll go over how to add widgets to a CODESYS visualization. So in previous videos, we've talked about how to create visualizations in your project, create multiple visualizations. We've even added a bunch of widgets actually in those videos just to sort of test out our visualization and figure out what screen we were on. We've added some push buttons. So in this video, we'll be taking a little bit deeper look at widgets and the properties that they have and how to set up and modify those properties. There's a lot of widgets that are available in CODESYS with a lot of different properties, so there are certainly common ones, but it'll be too long of a video to go over everything, so I'll go over some of the basics, and hopefully that will be enough to get everyone started. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of previous videos that you can check out, and we'll be relying on some of those videos throughout this project, specifically adding your own images. We'll be using that portion. So if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. We're starting from our training project 1, which we've been using in our other projects. But if you haven't been necessarily following along each video, then really what we're going to use is just a visualization here. So I've gone over in a video how to add visualizations. We're going to use a signal or message or two from our CAN bus just to show how to link that in. And then we're going to use some variables that we created in our programming interface. So let's get started. So I'm going to move to screen 3 because that's a blank screen here, and our screen 1 and 2 already has some things on it. So first off, we can see screen 3 here is blank. So down on the right, so in just a note, I'm using CODESYS 3.5 SP8. Depending on the version you're using, this may look a bit different for you. I know in 3.5.4 this part has changed a bit, but in general it should be around the same. So I'm going to come here to Toolbox, and we're just going to add a few controls to our screen. So let's first go to Measurement Controls and add a meter. This is a common one that you're gonna use on the displays as a gauge, and then we're gonna come back here and add maybe a progress bar, and lastly, how about a push switch. So it's odd here. You can see mine, some of them don't show pictures. I'm not really sure why, but when I drag it on the screen it shows up correctly. So the first thing to note, and I think I briefly touched on this in previous videos, but my widgets are this kind of white color, and that is actually coming if we come to our visualization manager and come to style settings here. There's different styles that you can choose from, and these kind of on the right, it shows what the widgets of that style look like. So for me, I've chosen the white style, which is why they look the way they do, but we could, choose this gradient axial style, and if we come to our screen, you'll notice our widget look has changed a bit. So you can play around with the styles, and I'm going to move it back to the white style because I think it looks good, but we'll also go over how you can add your own images as well. So you can completely change the style of the widgets to add your own created gauges and images if you would like. You don't need to use any style CODESYS necessarily gives you. Okay, looking at the gauge widget, kind of looking at all of the widgets, I'll go over some common things. So all of them are going to have positions. I'm not going to go over everything because I think a lot of these properties here, when you click on a widget, you have a properties window, and a lot of these are either self-explanatory. They a lot of times have a description down here, so if you click on it and you look at the bottom, there's a description of what it does. And you can always play around with it yourself to determine what some of these do, because as I said, this video would be huge if I were to go over every single property of every widget. There's obviously a lot of widgets and a lot of properties. But I will say one of the more important ones that is pretty common to every widget is a value, or sometimes you'll see it as variable. So either a value here or a variable property. And this is what you're going to link to, that's either going to control the widget or will give you feedback. So in this case, we have a gauge, and this is going to be controlled by something. So controlled by most likely a variable. So for our case, I want this gauge to be controlled by a can variable coming into our project, and I'll say engine speed. So I want it to be controlled by engine speed. Maybe I want this progress bar here to be controlled by fuel level, or maybe I want it to be controlled by a custom variable in my project. And then this is a push button. So on the screen, the user might push this button, and I want to know when the user pushed it. So I'm going to assign a variable to this that is going to change when the user pushes it. So we'll see that and how to do that. I'm going to set it up really quick for this gauge. So as I said, let's pretend that our gauge, we want this to be hooked up to our engine speed value coming in over can. So for all of our properties, we're going to find our value, double click, and hit the ... and we can see all of our variables that we've set up in our project are going to be here. So if we want to find variables that we've set up in our programming portion, the PRG portions, we can expand application, and I'll see the two programming portions or programs. And for instance, I could expand PLC PRG, and I see the variables I've set up here. If I want my can variables, I can expand IO Global's mapping. And for instance, I see engine speed here, which I know is one of my can variables. So I can go ahead and select that. And now my gauge is linked to my engine speed variable in my project. So I won't go over how to set up can here because that was done in another video, but I will just show. If I go to my engine ECU, we can see I'm selecting, or I'm bringing in receiving one message from my engine controller, the EEC1 message, and in that is engine speed, which I'm then linking to my gauge here. So this gauge will now show engine speed as it comes in. Okay, so we can do that for all of our projects or our widgets here. So let's do that, and we're gonna test this out. I won't be able to test the can in simulation mode. I would have to put it on the display, so that won't be tested. But let's look here, and in a previous video we've incremented a variable, and so if you followed the previous videos, you'll have a setup like this in one of the programs, and essentially all I'm doing is every time this program loops, I'm incrementing this variable by 1, and it will go until it hits 200 and then turn back to 0. So it's pretty simple, but I can link this variable, it's an integer variable, I can link it to our progress bar, and what we should expect is we should expect to see the progress bar increasing as the variable increases. So I'm gonna do that and come into our application and select our PLC PRG program, and I see increment variable, which is the one I used. So we're gonna link that, and finally I'm going to create a variable in our PLC PRG program, to control this. So I'm going to say, I'm going to just create a variable called push button. Okay, it seems CODESYS has frozen. And we're back. Okay, so I'm going to create a variable called push button. I'm going to make it a bool and set it equal to false at initialization. And I am just going to monitor push button. Well, yeah, we'll see it down here. So I'm going to come back to, so all I've done here is I've created a Boolean variable, which is either on or off, which matches with our push button here. It's either going to be on or off. So I'm going to come into variable and link that to our push button Boolean variable we have. Okay, so I've linked up some things, so let's just check this out. Before we go any further, what we expect here is, since this is linked to our increment variable, we expect this to move up, and then as we click this, we expect to see our push button variable change values. So let's go online and make sure we're in simulation mode, so it's simulated on the computer. All this has been covered in previous trainings, so if you don't know what I'm doing, please go check out those other trainings. And we're going to just hit online and OK. We can see down here it's loading, and I'm going to hit that. And so we can see it's increasing, and it's going to, so I think why we see it's loading is because we haven't set up our range correctly. But that's, so it's sort of acting as we expect. It's, increasing. And then I think here probably our range is set to 100. So right now it's increasing from 100 to 200 where we can't see, and then resetting. So let's see if our push button's set correctly. So here we expect it to be true, which it is. And we can see our push button value is true, and then I can come back and click it off and come back here, and we can see the push button is now set to false. So that looks right. So we could extend programming, for instance, to make it so this only increments when our push button is on, for instance, if we wanted to be a little bit more clever in this scenario, but I don't know that I'll spend the time to do that, as I had a whole video on doing some basic logic in your programs. So this all looks good. The only thing that I'll mention, so our variables are hooked up correctly. So now let's maybe take a look at the other properties that we can see. So our position, this is going to be X and Y with height. I mean, that should be pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so some widgets have, if you look in background of the gauge widget, we can see our image color, and we can sort of change some of the colors of the widget itself. But some widgets have something called own image, which I briefly mentioned before. And this is a cool thing in CODESYS where we can completely replace the background image with our own image. So in this case, I can replace the CODESYS gauge image with a gauge image that I've created. So to do that, we're going to say own image, and under image, we're going to double click and do the ... And this part will require that you have an image pool object added to your project. So I've gone over this in the video covering adding custom images to the project. So in that video, I added a few images. One of them was a gauge image that I quickly created for the project. So I'm going to select that gauge image now. If you don't have this image pool and don't know what I'm doing here, please go back and watch the video about adding custom images. Okay, so I'm going to select OK, and I click off of it, and there we go. So there is my image that I've created, and you can see it's poorly created. You know, it's you have this sort of bad-looking gray or black things around it. So I didn't spend a lot of time making this gauge look good, but it is the image I created. Okay, so you know, we can go further. So if we look, so we've added our own. One of the things that we can't, or I can't seem to do in CODESYS is change the image of the needle, and I think that's because the needle is going to be what is dynamic in the gauge, so it's going to change. So I don't know that you can add your own image, but if you come to arrow, you can select different arrow styles based on what they have and select different arrow colors. So I'm going to stick with the thin 3D arrow, and you know, you can select a color here. The arrow start and arrow end gives the angle that it starts and ends, so you can see that is going to align with the scale currently, but you can mess around with that. You can add a second little arrow here if you want, just to, I guess, further specify what value you're at. Okay, looking at the scale, there's, you know, some things we can do. One of the things that's a little finicky about CODESYS is, if you'll notice, we're receiving engine speed, and we come into our engine speed, and the value we're going to receive is 0 to 8,000 RPMs. So CODESYS won't automatically scale your widgets based on what they're assigned to, so you need to do that yourself. So our engine speed, if we expect or want to show on this gauge 0 to 8,000 RPMs, we need to set that in the scale, because right now we won't be able to see 8,000 RPMs. It'll just show up to 100, and then the needle will be at the maximum at anything past 100, which is not what we want. So if we want to go to 8,000 RPMs, we need to change the scale end to 8,000. But if I try to do that now, it's going to draw an error, and it's going to say the current settings of your scale will produce a too large amount of visualization elements. Okay, if you look, this is because our main scale and our subscale are very small. So if we go to 8,000, it's saying there's going to be too many little tiny lines. So we first need to increase our main and subscale as much as possible before we can increase our scale end. So here I've increased my main scale, I'm going to increase my subscale to 100, and now I'll try to increase my scale end to 8,000 and see. Okay, so, and you can see why that it would have been too many visualization elements. You know, right now there's a ton. So now that I've got, though, my scale end set correctly, I can increase my main and subscales. So let's maybe say our main scale will be set to 1,000, and our subscale will be set to 500. And there we go. So that looks a bit better. Okay, so now our engine speed value will be receiving 0 to 8,000, and we've linked that to our gauge, which then will show on the scale, or the needle movement will be from 0 to 8,000, as we expect. Okay, you know, so there's other things that we can do with our scale, change the color, show it or hide it completely, frame inside, frame outside. So our label is, I believe, these units here, and we can change that. So, you know, if we wanted them to be a white color, for instance, to show up better, we can change that. You can change the formatting. So if we didn't want it to be in 3000.0, we could change that to, you know, %D, for instance, and now it's going to cut out the 0.0. So there's a lot of properties here, as well as positioning, and you can define color areas if you want. So for instance, here I could define a color area from 7,000 to 8,000 RPMs. I could define this area to be a red color on my gauge to show that we're getting into some, you know, really high RPMs. So there's a lot you can do with these gauges and properties. Just taking a quick look at the bar here, we have a, you know, again, our values. So what, like I said before, why we were seeing the bar fill up and then it would stay full for a couple seconds before it would reset, and that's because our maximum value is set at 100, whereas the signal we have it linked to, our increment variable signal, we can see here, will go up to 200. So we could either change this to turn back to 0 at 100, or since we're looking at our visualization elements in this video, we'll change it here to a minimum value of 0, a maximum of 200. And here we can change between blocks and bar. So a bar is just a straight bar. We can add some text if we want, I think. I don't know what, there we go, it adds it to the middle. Won't do that though. And so this is something that you'll see a lot of times called state variables, and there's different ones, but this invisible, you can set a variable to make this object invisible. And I don't see it on the gauge, but a lot of other widgets have it. And so if, for instance, let's link that to our push button variable. That'll be a fun little test. So what I would expect to happen here is if we push this push button, now that we've linked this invisible property to our Boolean variable here, which is controlled by our push button. So our push button is going to control our push button variable and either make it true or false depending on the value of our push button. And now we've linked this invisible to the push button variable. So when it's true, we expect this to be invisible. So when this is pushed, this becomes invisible. When it's not pushed, this becomes visible. So let's just check this out. So here we go. We can go back online, say download. We're still in simulation mode as we were before. And here we are. So we can see now our bar is filling up exactly as we expect. So before it was being full and then waiting, but now that we've changed the scale, it's filling up and resetting as we expect. And I push this and it turns invisible, and I unclick it and it shows again. So this is exactly how we expect this to function, and we've done that by modifying the properties of the widgets. Okay, you know, I think that pretty much does it. You know, some things like this, I see in every element or widget in CODESYS is going to be a bit unique. So, you know, this is an LED, for instance, and we'll see again the variable, the common variable one. But certain other things, it does have an invisible variable, and you have this background where you can change the color, I believe. Usually that would switch. It's kind of strange. Maybe it's when it's on, I think it'll this part will change to green, for instance, if you select it. So every widget is a bit different, and you're gonna have to play around with some. Right, that's an LED, so we have to assign it to a variable to work. So we'll just assign it to the push button variable again. Little easy. Now it should hopefully work. There we go. Turns green. So yeah, so I mean, you know, like I said, there's a lot of widgets that you can add, and you're gonna have to play around with some of the settings and read down here what they do. But there's a lot that can be done with the widgets and in setting up your project how you want. So I hope this was informative in how to add certain widgets to your visualization and set them up how you want. Thanks for watching.